Hello and welcome to another episode of the Competitive Inquisition. My name's Northy from the wargaming team Epic Flail, and in this video I'm going to be talking about Warhammer 40,000 terrain and asking the question, how good are the terrain rules when it comes to playing Warhammer 40,000 competitively? But before I get into it, I just want to thank everybody that's given me advice, both in person and online, around the content that I'm creating. It's really useful, super helpful. Well, it's almost all useful and helpful.
Oh, what do you reckon to those 40k videos I've been doing?
Oh, the content's pretty good, but could do with less of your face.
So I've had a bunch more games in, loads more reflections, and what I'm doing going forward is I'm making the videos more interactive and visual, and I'm also breaking it down subject at a time. So this video, we're just going to be talking about terrain, but in the future, with the next few weeks, there'll be other videos coming out about like secondary objectives, dice mechanics, also all sorts of other things that I've considered and thought about as a competitive player. But in this video, we're just focusing on terrain. Do give us more feedback though, always up to people's feedback and comments on the videos that we're creating. Really appreciate it. Like and subscribe for more, all that stuff. We've got some podcasts coming, some 40k podcasts coming with other people that I'm collaborating with, which should be great. Battle reports, all kinds of things in the pipeline in the future. So stick with us, come with us on this journey and share us your feedback. It's super appreciated. So terrain, how important is terrain in competitive rule sets? Well, my opinion is terrain is really important. You want to be finding something in the middle of a spectrum which on one side has terrain which plays no part and is almost a token thing on the table and you don't really feel like you're interacting with it. On the other end, where you've got terrain which plays way too much of a role, just completely manipulates and overrides strategies and kind of funnels the game down quite a narrow way of playing it. You want something in the middle where you feel like terrain is relevant, but it's not relevant to the point where there's some strategies you just can't do. The terrain is just destroying it. You want something in the middle that you can interact with, engage with, and feel like it's having an effect on your decision making. You know, you think about like, I always think about like historical battles and stuff. The thing that got me into wargaming was my appreciation of history and like love of learning about big historical battles. And the thing I always enjoyed exploring there was just how generals used terrain and strategy to their advantage. How did they beat greatly outnumbered forces through manipulating and managing the terrain? And, you know, I kind of want the same experience replicated in the war games that I play. I want to think, I made some really good and clever decisions with regards to the terrain there. So you want something in the middle. The other thing I think you want, this matters less maybe for the competitive gamer and more for the casual, but I still feel like it's an important factor, is you want it to look good. You don't want terrain that is just like the pure 2D can feel like you're just playing a totally different game. It doesn't feel very real. Although we all know the Warhammer 40,000 universe isn't, well, maybe it is. Could be out there, guys. Could be a parallel universe. But the sort of 2D flat neoprene terrain that we had in War Machine is obviously not very thematic. It can be quite difficult to get new players into the game because it looks a little bit weird. See, that can be frowned upon. But then on the other hand, you don't want like so much like wacky terrain that it just takes up the whole board, or it just doesn't really work. You can't really have models on top of everything because the ground is so bumpy and you've got like so much terrain everywhere. So you want it to look good, and you also want it to feel like it's impacting on the game, but not to the point where it overrides your decision-making process or your strategy. So we're looking for something in the middle. So how does Warhammer 40,000 do on both those scales?
I got a bad feeling about this.
So the first one is like, how relevant is Warhammer 40,000 terrain in a game? Well, before we even get to that though, I feel like it's worth pointing out just the terrain rules themselves. And I've got to be completely honest, they are completely wild. Like, it's just so overly complicated as a set of rules. Like, I get what Games Workshop are trying to do. They're trying to say to people, hey, you know, you can kind of create whatever you want and you can create really diverse terrain. But from a rule set perspective, it's just so confusing. It's too many options, too much depth. If I just get out the rule book, we just look at the rule book and go to the terrain rules. So just the fact that you have terrain categories that then each of them can have completely different terrain traits instantly to me just creates way too many options. It just completely overcomplicates things. And it means that before a game or you know, the start of the game, you have to go into real detail just to explain and clarify what everything has. Now, I know from a competitive perspective, certain tournaments and series have kind of an agreed set way of doing this, and there's definitely a standard. And that's a good thing, and I'll come on to that in a second. If anything, it's a good job that exists, because I think if it wasn't for that, it'd just be pure chaos out there. But if you just look at the rules themselves, the fact that you have, hills, obstacles, area terrain, and buildings, all of which can have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 different traits, it's just way too much. GW kind of spell out and give some indication of what common terrain features look like. They say, look, ruins, it's area terrain, and it's scalable, breachable, light cover, defensible, and obscuring. But this is clearly kind of a guidance. The rules themselves read, each terrain feature can have one or more terrain traits, each of which bestows additional rules. Once the battlefield has been created, both players must agree which terrain traits apply to which terrain features. I mean, why overcomplicate it so much? Why not just tell people what a ruin is? Here is a ruin. Here is a hill. Here is a water feature. It doesn't have to be so overly complicated. Now, I do understand that if you just wanted to play this game casually, then that's not a bad thing, because, you could just get all the terrain out that you have, put it on a board and say, right, what do you reckon this should all be? And you can go through the process of agreeing that. But even then, as it's a casual play, that feels fairly clunky. It feels a little bit over the top. And, having choice and stuff, I'm pro for that. I want people to be able to create games and experiences that are fun for them. But from a competitive perspective, it just feels like way too much. And again, I know at the sharper end of the spectrum, people that are playing like really high level tournaments, hopefully, from what I can gather, those things are already predetermined and set up and there's less ambiguity. But just the foundations of the rule set just feel way, way, way too complicated. The other thing from the rules themselves, which just seems really unusual, is the whole line of sight rule. So what I'm used to from other systems is a very, very simple mechanic by which if one base, you can draw line of sight with a laser pen from one base to another base, you can see it. And terrain might impact that. An obstacle might block something up to a certain base size, or a wood so far into a wood might obscure it, but it's never that complicated. You just drop the laser pen, draw the line, check the rules, determine line of sight. Warhammer 40,000, getting down at eye level and seeing if a bit of your model can see a bit of their model, and if that's the case, they can shoot at it, but then obviously you've got to reference the terrain rules because some obscuring can block that. It's just a ridiculously overly complicated system. I don't understand why they don't just have base sizes that correlate to the size of the model and just do some kind of laser-based system. They could, just put models on a base, have the base to be a representation of how big the model is, cross-reference base sizes to terrain features and say, this size base can be seen over this size obstruction or piece of terrain, and just have a straight line. Just the fact that you have people kind of pushing models in to hide them around certain pieces of terrain, and it's mad. I was playing a guy the other night and I could see literally a tiny spike on Bellacor's wing, and I could shoot at it. That is a strange way of creating a rule set for something that wants to be competitive. Again, casual, that can be fun. Casual play, it can be fun getting down to the eye level of the model, and you can see how a designer would go, this will be immersive, this will be fun, this will be thematic, people, I can really see it. I get that, but I'm not thinking about the game like that. I'm thinking about the game competitively. I want games and experiences that feel clean and smooth, and, best player wins. Person who applied the best strategy at the table wins the game. Line of sight is absolutely not that. That feels like a bad rule if you're wanting to play this game competitively. What that does seem to do is just create opportunities for abuse. I'd love to know if do people pose their models so their arms are in just all crunched down. I was joking the other day with the guys that my Imperial Knights, maybe they're all kneeling down. Maybe they're short. Do people manipulate that? Because it feels like it's a system that's open to abuse. If you're building a flyer, I've seen people that have the flyers that just go straight on the base with no height extension on the base. It's just literally straight to the bottom bit of the base. You could argue, well, there you go. They're pretty difficult to see now. They're very low to the ground. If you've got it quite high up, you want it to look quite cool, like a unit of flyers all at different heights. Well, that seems pretty stupid because all you're doing is you're just letting your model be seen by other stuff higher up. Or maybe there's an advantage to that. Maybe the higher you are, the more stuff you can see. Either way, from a competitive perspective, it's awful. But it's not the end of the world. Like I said, the game I had the other day where it was much more clearly defined and there was lots of obstructions where a lot of that line of sight stuff didn't really play an effect, other than my massive night, so you could just see absolutely everywhere because of Titanic. But whatever, getting used to that, they just have to take it on the chin. So there are ways around it, and I do appreciate that. But if GW was serious about the competitive aspect of the game, they could just clear that up, and maybe even in like the Grand Tournament pack or whatever, just have a terrain section of that saying, right, at a competitive tournament level, here are the terrain rules. It's still the same 40k that you know, but if you want to play it competitively, we've refined the terrain so it looks like this. You could argue that that's already going on, that's already happening at certain events and tournaments, and I appreciate that's a good thing, but it would feel like GW take the competitive scene more seriously if they just set the bar. They pay people full time to think about the game and examine the game competitively and develop the rules. So do that. The other thing that feels quite confusing about the terrain rules is even if you can see a model, so you do the whole like line of sight, get down to their angle, see if you can see it, and you'll go, oh, there we go. I can see that unit. They're in those ruins, but like there's huge holes in the ruins. I can like clearly see the whole unit. There are then rules that goes, well, actually, that ruin, you can't see them unless they're touching the ruin. So even the LOS rule of like you get down to that level, see if you can see it, you then have to cross-reference that with the type of terrain that the opposing model is in and any terrain that's in the way, and then kind of check that. So even the LOS can I see it thing is then sits within another set of rules, which will then define, okay, you can see it, but what terrain are they in and what's in between you? That again just feels like unnecessary complication. Could be way more streamlined, way simpler system. Although I do get why this exists. Games Workshop pride themselves on how their models look, how their boards look, the thematic nature of the game. And most people don't approach this game being like, what are the line of sight rules? What are the terrain rules? They're like, that looks cool. I want to shoot at it. I want to roll some dice. I want my board to look really fun. So I do appreciate why these tensions sit there. I just wish there could be a way for it to be less ambiguous and a bit smoother and a bit fairer from a competitive perspective. So in terms of where the terrain is at on that scale, I feel like 40k terrain does play and have a very strong impact on the game. It's really relevant, and I can imagine a lot of boards that are set up have a huge impact on the type of game that is played out. I will caveat though with the ITC, WTC setups do seem much more sensible. They've clearly had competitive players sit around and be like, okay, how do we manage the terrain system to create the fairest, most balanced game? And I would argue that, those games, that is certainly more the case than kind of a casual game that you play at the club, or maybe a game where you say to your friend, we'll have a competitive game, but we'll just kind of use whatever scenery the club have got available or whatever, and you kind of patch something together. So I do appreciate at a more competitive tournament level, some of those problems are addressed, but just the fact that there are there's a Tabletop Titans video that's like over an hour long of those two guys being like, oh, here's how you set up a table. I mean, you've got to do a video that's more of an hour long to tell people, here's how you set up a table. You've probably got a problem with your rule set. Like, you shouldn't have to do that. It's good that they've done that. I'm glad they've done that. There's clearly a need for them to do that. It's got like 200,000 views or whatever. But just the fact that exists flags for me a problem. And I think outside of those environments where two players approach the game and either have like a pre-agreed terrain setup or are very sensible and fair about how they do it, I bet some people having awful games of 40k where opponents are like setting a board up and it's just massively favouring one person over the other and just creates really negative, boring experiences. So definitely leaning towards the has way too much of an impact on the game, or I guess in some cases has way too less of an impact and people just set up terrible boards because there's no real clear system to do this. Players are just kind of left to their own devices to be like, well, do you know what? There's some area terrain, there's some traits, do whatever. I don't think that creates balanced games. And I know a lot of people don't play 40k for the balance of play because it's fun, but surely you want a positive, enjoyable, engaging experience in which you don't just sit there going, well, there's not much I could do here. This is a bit naff. What I like about 40k terrain, though, is, War Machine was everything like 2D neoprene. And although that was really useful from a competitive perspective, it kind of looked bad. And you would get people come up and just not really be that interested in the game because everything kind of looked just like a bit rubbish and a bit 2D. So I think 40k's got a great opportunity to just bring people to a table and get people interested. You know, you watch a game of 40k, it can be a really enjoyable thematic experience. I think it does very well on that front. It can look good. Although, again, some of the 40k terrain that I've seen at tournaments that's just kind of like an open book, it's just kind of like straight cardboard, looks fairly awful, but that's people compensating for some of the wacky rules that I've outlined and try to make just a bit of a clearer, fairer experience on the table. So in conclusion, it's definitely problematic. The 1/40,000 terrain, I think, has a problem, particularly from a competitive perspective. There are definitely efforts to sort it out and reduce it, and you can address it. I think the game I had the other night, it was much better. But even so, 1/40,000 has some fundamental issues with its terrain setup and system. There's just way too much choice. It's way too messy. I think it needs to be much more defined. GW need to own the fact that people play this game competitively and make some efforts to create a setup and a rule system which just feels a bit cleaner and a bit smoother, and less of this, let's get down eye model and see if I can see one tiny bit of your hull so I can shoot it with this gun. If they did stuff like that, you wouldn't have to, if they address that, you wouldn't have to have this like playing with intent thing. You know, I'm putting this Land Raider in, my intent is for your Castellan to not be able to see it. You know, well, can it see it or not? Yeah, it can. Well, my intent is for you to not see it. Right. Well, I guess I can't shoot it then. It would be better if it was like, right, I just want to put this there. There's the laser pen. Oh, no, you can't see it. Great. Okay. Next activity. You don't even have to do any of that playing for intent thing. The playing with intent is because the terrain is honestly pretty awful as a system. I think it's pretty bad. But it's also not the end of the world. There's a great community out there. There are people playing loads of competitive games to a really high level, a really smooth level. There are videos and guides out there of how you can create tables that are good, and tournament organisers clearly have it on their mind. They're clearly approaching the game thinking, how do I make the best experience possible for competitive players? Which is great and which is good, and I think at the end of the day saves it. It's the community recognising that there are issues with the terrain and doing something about it. But underneath that, I bet there's an awful lot of games where people are sat there thinking this terrain is awful. Or maybe not even realising, maybe they're just thinking their army's awful, but really their opponents set up a cheeky board and they're getting blasted off left, right and centre, or they're just sneaking up and they can never see them. So I don't think it's great, but it's not the end of the world. It's just a strong reflection I've had based upon the experiences I've had outside of Games Workshop. And I feel like if there's a future edition, there's a lot of work to do. Okay, so that sums up my thoughts. Thanks for watching the show. Really appreciate it. We've got loads more to come, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.